Early in 1942, from his command post in East Prussia, a pronouncement came from Adolf Hitler regarding the United States, a judgment that would inextricably link itself to Germany's downfall. He confided to those closest to him that he foresaw little future for the American nation. It was, he asserted, a country in decline, burdened by its racial composition and inherent social inequalities. The entire character of American society, in his estimation, appeared half Jewish, half African, making it incomprehensible how such a state could maintain cohesion. Thousands of miles away, on the opposite coast, an industrialist then 57 years old, named Henry Kaiser, was sketching designs on a hotel notepad within a small California shipyard office in Richmond. Though he had never constructed a vessel before, his experience spanned dams, roadways, and bridges. Ships, however, presented a different order of complexity. Established builders claimed an 8-month timeline for a single cargo vessel. Observing his own drawing, Kaiser informed his team they would deliver one in just 4 days. Hitler had presumed the Americans to be weak. This industrialist was about to demonstrate the profound error in that assumption. The roots of this profound strategic miscalculation stretched back years, long before any overt act of war. In the period preceding the conflict, German military intelligence units compiled extensive reports detailing American industrial capacity, military preparedness, and the national character. Their findings consistently pointed to a civilian nation, a populace of merchants and consumers rather than hardened combatants. Its armed forces in 1939 were amongst the world's smallest, even surpassed by Portugal's. American factories primarily yielded automobiles and domestic appliances, not the tanks and aircraft required for modern warfare. A prolonged period of peace had, it was believed, fostered a reluctance for sacrifice among its people. Hitler's advisors further reinforced his conviction, dismissing American war production claims as mere propaganda. When, in May of 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt declared the United States would produce 50,000 aircraft annually, the German High Command summarily rejected this figure as pure fantasy. In the previous year, American military aircraft production had not even reached 3,000 units. The notion of a 20-fold increase appeared utterly preposterous. Hermann Göring, architect of the Luftwaffe and a key figure in Hitler's inner circle, echoed this disdain for American capabilities. He had personally overseen the transformation of Germany's air arm from nothing into the most feared aerial force across Europe. He understood the intricate demands of producing modern combat aircraft, the need for precise engineering, specialized metal alloys, a highly skilled labor force, and years of accumulated experience to perfect manufacturing techniques. America, he believed, possessed none of these prerequisites. The very idea that they could somehow conjure an air force from automobile assembly lines struck him as entirely laughable. German generals also drew on historical experience. During the final year of the First World War, American forces had arrived in France, performing adequately, yet their late entry, comparatively low casualties, and limited impact on strategic direction fostered an impression of relative inconsequence. The image of these green doughboys cemented the conviction that Americans lacked the intrinsic resilience for sustained, grueling combat. Albert Speer, who would later assume command of Germany's armaments production, frequently witnessed Hitler's dinner conversations concerning America. Hitler was convinced that the Americans had played a minor role in the 1914 to 1918 conflict, having sustained minimal losses. He therefore concluded they would certainly crumble under a true test, lacking genuine fighting spirit. Furthermore, he articulated that no cohesive American people existed. They were simply a disparate collection of immigrants from various nations and races. This racial lens was central to Hitler's entire worldview, postulating that national strength derived from racial purity. Germany, with its perceived Aryan heritage, possessed an inherent superiority that would undoubtedly manifest on the battlefield. America, a supposed mongrel nation of diverse immigrants, Jews, and African Americans, could not possibly rival the martial vigor of the German Volk. However, the The German analysis contained a fundamental flaw. They assessed American potential based entirely on its peacetime performance. They observed a nation unmobilized and erroneously concluded it was incapable of mobilizing. They saw consumer goods factories and assumed these plants could not be repurposed for weapons manufacturing. They perceived diversity as an inherent weakness, believing it fractured national will. In each instance, their judgment was spectacularly wrong. The pivot began before America formally entered the global conflict. In the summer of 1940, with France fallen and Great Britain facing imminent invasion, President Roosevelt challenged American industry to achieve what he termed a miracle of production. Automobile assembly lines would cease car manufacturing. Appliance plants would halt refrigerator production. Every lathe, every press, every assembly line across the nation would be converted to war material. This initiative transcended a mere call to arms. It represented a complete reimagining of the American economic structure. In 1941, over 3 million automobiles left American factories. Over the subsequent 4 years, barely 139 more would be built. The entire automotive sector's capacity was now directed towards weapons. Chrysler began producing aircraft fuselages. General Motors turned out airplane engines, weaponry, trucks, and armored vehicles. Packard manufactured Rolls-Royce engines for the British Air Force. Companies accustomed to crafting kitchen appliances now learned to mass-produce ammunition. This conversion transpired with astonishing swiftness, owing to capabilities German strategists entirely failed to comprehend. The underlying principle was standardization and interchangeable components. American factories had pioneered mass production techniques, allowing disparate facilities to manufacture parts that fit together perfectly. A carburetor from Ohio could be mated with an engine from Michigan, which then powered a vehicle assembled in California. This system, refined over decades for civilian applications, was now directed towards instruments of war. Skeptics voiced their disbelief. Aircraft, they argued, were not automobiles. One could not simply stamp out a bomber like a car. The necessary tolerances were too precise, the systems too intricate. A single heavy bomber comprised over 1 million components, compared to an automobile's 15,000. Henry Kaiser disregarded these doubts. In December 1940, he secured a government contract to construct 30 cargo vessels for Britain. He possessed no shipyard, no prior experience in ship construction, and no workforce trained in maritime fabrication. What he did possess was a system. This approach proved decisive. Kaiser viewed shipbuilding not through the lens of traditional shipwrights, but as a manufacturing challenge. The specific product, be it a ship, a dam, or a highway, was secondary to the underlying process. Every manufacturing operation, he reasoned, could be analyzed, deconstructed, optimized, and then scaled exponentially. Traditional shipbuilders accumulated expertise through years of apprenticeship. A skilled riveter spent years mastering their trade. Kaiser lacked such luxury. He had mere months. Thus, he engineered processes learnable in days. He substituted machinery for labor whenever feasible, investing in equipment to automate tasks previously performed by hand. Established shipbuilders predicted failure, claiming such vessels, built by novices, would inevitably sink. Kaiser proved them mistaken. His ships emerged not only faster than conventionally built vessels, but also superior in quality. The defect rate in Kaiser's yards was less than half that of conventional shipyards, demonstrating how a systematic approach to accelerated production could also elevate standards. He applied the same modular principles that had ensured the early completion of the Hoover Dam. Rather than constructing a ship keel up on a single slipway, he prefabricated entire sections at various locations, assembling them later like building blocks. He opted for welding over riveting, a method both quicker and requiring less specialized labor. He recruited workers from across the nation, provided housing, established childcare for their children, and developed a healthcare system to maintain their health and productivity. The transformation of ordinary citizens into shipbuilders occurred at a pace defying all conventional wisdom. Individuals who had never seen the ocean, handled a welding torch, or stepped inside an industrial facility learned to construct ships in mere weeks. Kaiser's training regimens were relentlessly efficient. A new worker could become a competent welder in 10 days and a productive member of a shipbuilding team within a month. These workers arrived from every corner of the country. Farmers from Oklahoma, displaced by drought, factory hand from Detroit laid off during the Depression, women new to employment outside the home, African Americans seeking opportunities denied in the segregated South. At its zenith, the workforce in Kaiser's Richmond yards exceeded 90,000, with almost a third being women. These female factory workers became emblematic of America's wartime mobilization. They drilled rivets, welded seams, and installed electrical wiring, undertaking tasks previously exclusive to men. Government initiatives through posters and films celebrated their contributions, depicting strong, resolute women in industrial settings, creating enduring images of the home front effort. Thousands of such women across America, laboring in shipyards and aircraft plants, proved that the workforce could expand in ways German strategists simply hadn't conceived. The established shipbuilders watched with incredulity. They had constructed ships using the same methods for decades, believing they understood the limits of possibility. Kaiser's techniques violated every tenet of their craft. Ships, they knew, were meant to be riveted, not welded. Construction belonged on the slipway, not in disparate fabrication sheds. Workers traditionally trained for years, not weeks. Yet, Kaiser's methods worked. In 1941, the average time to build a Liberty ship, the standard cargo vessel of the conflict, was 230 days. By 1942, Kaiser's yards had reduced this to 45 days, then 30, then just 20. In November of 1942, the Richmond shipyard launched the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in a remarkable 4 days and 15 and a half hours. From keel laying to launch, this entire process took less time than a German U-boat required to traverse the Atlantic. The Germans now faced a strategic crisis entirely unforeseen. Admiral Karl Donitz, who led Germany's U-boat fleet, had predicated his strategy on a single, critical calculation. His submarines would sink Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. In the early months of 1942, this strategy appeared to be yielding success. German U-boats patrolled the American East Coast during what they termed the Second Happy Time, sending hundreds of merchant vessels to the bottom within sight of the shoreline. Oil tankers burned off Florida's coast. Cargo ships vanished near New Jersey beaches. Reinhard Hartigen, commander of the U-123, was among the first U-boat captains to hunt in American waters. In January 1942, he torpedoed ships so close to land that he could observe the glow of city lights reflected in the smoke. Plumes. The Americans had neglected to implement blackout procedures or organize defensive convoys, seemingly inviting attack. Hartigen sank 8 ships on his initial patrol, returning to Germany a celebrated hero. Other U-boat commanders followed. Throughout the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines destroyed nearly 400 ships in American coastal waters. The losses were devastating. Fuel vital for Allied tanks now coated Atlantic beaches. Food intended for British civilians spoiled at the ocean floor. Strategic materials critical for the war effort simply disappeared beneath the waves. Donitz believed he was prevailing, his submarines inflicting damage at a rate exceeding his most optimistic projections. Should these losses persist, Britain faced strangulation, and the American war effort would crumble before it could even fully mobilize. But even as the U-boats racked up their kills, the shipyards were accelerating their output. In 1942, American shipyards launched 8 million tons of new shipping. By 1943, that figure soared to 19 million tons. By autumn 1943, new construction finally outpaced losses. For every vessel a U-boat sank, 2 more were launched to replace it. Donitz observed these growing figures with increasing apprehension. His submarines were sinking ships at a pace that would have secured victory in the First World War. This, however, was not that conflict. This was a struggle against an adversary whose industrial capacity defied comprehension. The relentless mathematics offered no reprieve. Dönitz calculated that his U-boats needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping each month to starve Britain. In 1942, they nearly achieved this. Yet by 1943, American shipyards alone were launching over 1 million tons monthly. The target continually moved, always out of reach, always receding. Worse, the Americans were learning. The initial catastrophes off the East Coast exposed glaring weaknesses in anti-submarine warfare. Convoys were rapidly organized. Aircraft were deployed to patrol shipping lanes. New technologies, like radar and improved sonar, provided defenders with crucial advantages they had previously lacked. In May 1943, Dönitz was compelled to withdraw his U-boats from the Atlantic. In a single month, 43 submarines had been lost. The tonnage sunk no longer justified the escalating casualties. The Battle of the Atlantic, critical for strangling Britain, was irrevocably lost. The surviving U-boat crews from the May debacle returned to occupied France in shock. They had departed believing in victory. They returned understanding defeat. The endless convoys they had once hunted now sailed with escorts they could not penetrate. Allied aircraft, once a rare sight, now seemed omnipresent. The technological edge German submarines had enjoyed had vanished. What unfolded at sea was mirrored in the air. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, near Detroit, became an emblem of American industrial power. Conceived by the renowned industrial architect Albert Kahn, the facility encompassed 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest single factory structure globally. Its objective was the mass production of the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber far more intricate than anything Ford had previously manufactured. The challenges were immense. The B-24 contained over 1 million individual parts and more than 300,000 rivets of 550 distinct sizes. It demanded precision engineering beyond the automotive industry's prior scope. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, examined the existing methods of aircraft manufacturer consolidated and found them primitive. Bombers were largely assembled outdoors, by hand, using techniques that had seen little change for decades. Sorensen proposed a revolutionary concept. He would construct bombers on a moving assembly line, just as automobiles were made. Critics dismissed the idea as madness. Dutch Kindelberger, president of North American Aviation, scoffed that one could not expect a blacksmith to craft a watch overnight. The skepticism held valid points. Aircraft manufacturing fundamentally differed from automobile production. A car could tolerate minor variations and still function perfectly. An aircraft with similar minor flaws could simply fall from the sky. Tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. Materials were exotic alloys, reacting differently than automotive steel. Systems, hydraulic, electrical, pneumatic, had to operate in perfect synchronicity at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Initially, Ford struggled. Government design alterations for the aircraft constantly disrupted the assembly line. Workers had to master entirely new skill sets. The press, derisively, referred to the facility as Willow Run rather than Willow Run. Senator Harry Truman initiated an inquiry into the delays, publicly questioning Ford's ability to fulfill its commitments. The problems were undeniably real. Consolidated Aircraft, the B-24's original designer, continued to implement modifications based on combat experience. Each change necessitated retooling at Ford's assembly line. Costly dies became obsolete overnight. Workers who had mastered one process required retraining for another. Ford's response was characteristically unyielding. The company assigned 200 engineers to work around the clock, translating Consolidated's hand-drawn sketches into precise manufacturing specifications. They generated 5 miles of technical drawings daily. When Consolidated's modifications rendered existing drawings obsolete before implementation, Ford engineers simply restarted without complaint. The company also decentralized production. Instead of manufacturing entire aircraft at Willow Run, Ford established a network of subcontractors who produce components, which were then shipped to the main plant for final assembly. Engines arrived from Buick and Flint. Propellers came from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. Landing gear originated from Goodyear in Ohio. The sheer logistics of this operation would have been impossible for any organization that had not spent decades perfecting supply chain management. By 1944, the initial problems had been overcome. Willow Run produced AB 24 every 63 minutes. At its peak production in April 1944, the plant rolled out 453 bombers in a single month. Between April 24th and 26th of that year, 100 completed bombers departed Willow Run in a mere 72 hours. Workers operated in 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The remaining 6 hours each day were dedicated to restocking parts, performing maintenance, and changing tooling. Despite this relentless schedule, the workforce decreased from 42,000 to 17,000 as efficiency continually improved, requiring fewer workers to produce the same number of bombers. Eventually, the Army Air Forces had to instruct Ford to reduce its pace. There was simply nowhere to store all the aircraft. Training bases overflowed with B-24s awaiting crews. Production capacity now surpassed the military's ability to deploy the aircraft. Meanwhile, overall American aircraft production reached figures that the German High Command had declared impossible. In 1944 alone, the United States manufactured over 96,000 military aircraft. This single year's output exceeded Japan's total aircraft production for the entire war. American factories constructed nearly 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945, representing approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. The sheer scale defied comprehension. At its height, American industry produced more aircraft in a single month than Germany possessed at the war's outset. Assembly lines ran continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shifts changed at midnight, noon, and again at midnight. The factories never ceased operation. Consider the practical implications of these numbers. 300,000 aircraft, when lined up wingtip to wingtip, would stretch for more than 30,000 miles, enough to encircle the Earth at the equator. The fuel required to operate these aircraft necessitated an entire petroleum infrastructure, tankers, pipelines, and refineries dedicated solely to aviation gasoline. Manning them demanded a training system capable of processing hundreds of thousands of young men, transforming civilians into combat aviators in under a year. The scope of American mobilization extended beyond what simple statistics could convey. Behind every aircraft, every ship, every tank lay a supply chain reaching back to mines, forests, and farms across the continent. Aluminum originated from bauxite or shipped from South America. Rubber, vital after Japanese conquest cut off Asian sources, came from plantations in Liberia and Brazil. Cotton for uniforms grew on southern farms. Food flowed from the agricultural heartland. The entire economy had been reoriented towards war production. Women who had never worked outside the home learned to operate machinery unknown to their mothers. African Americans migrated north, securing factory jobs previously inaccessible to them. Rural Americans flocked to industrial cities, where housing shortages forced families into shifts, with day workers occupying beds just vacated by night workers. The social transformation was as profound as the industrial one. The Germans directly experienced the consequences of their misjudgment in the European skies. Their pilots were among the world's most highly trained. Their aircraft, particularly fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, were formidable machines. In individual engagements, German pilots frequently outmatched their American counterparts. Early American bomber crews were notably inexperienced. Many pilots possessed fewer than 300 total flight hours when commencing combat missions. Navigational errors frequently led formations far off course. Bombing accuracy suffered. Coordination with fighter escorts remained imperfect. German pilots ruthlessly exploited these vulnerabilities. The Luftwaffe developed specific tactics designed to disrupt bomber formations and target stragglers. Head-on attacks, closing at over 600 miles per hour, left gunners only seconds to react. German fighters, armed with rockets, could engage from beyond the range of defensive machine guns. Yet, the attrition proved relentless. For every German aircraft downed, the Americans could produce 3 more. For every seasoned German pilot lost, the Americans could train 5 replacements. The Luftwaffe slowly bled out, not through a single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative weight of an adversary capable of absorbing losses and continuing the fight. American training programs were, in themselves, industrial operations. Flight schools processed thousands of cadets simultaneously. Instructors conducted multiple training sorties daily. Aircraft were plentiful because the same factories producing combat planes also manufactured trainers. The entire system was designed for maximum throughput, converting raw recruits into finished products with extreme efficiency. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was sustaining monthly losses of 25% of its aircrew and 40% of its aircraft. No air force could endure such losses indefinitely. The Thousand-Year Reich lacked 1,000 years' worth of pilots to sacrifice. German pilots, who had commenced the war with years of training and hundreds of flight hours, were replaced by men with mere weeks of instruction and dozens of hours in the cockpit. The average experience level of Luftwaffe fighter pilots steadily declined throughout 1944. By the war's conclusion, some German pilots flew their first combat mission with less than 100 total flight hours. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to improve. Early bomber crews, though inexperienced, saw their survivors from the 1943 raids become the instructors for the 1944 crews. Tactics evolved. Equipment advanced. The P-51 Mustang, with its extended range and exceptional performance, finally provided bomber formations with the protection they desperately needed. The German misjudgment extended beyond industrial capacity to the very fighting spirit of American soldiers. In February 1943, American ground forces first clashed with the German army at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The outcome seemed to validate every German prejudice. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps swept through the green American positions. Units disintegrated and fled. Equipment was abandoned. Command and control fractured. American casualties surpassed 6,000. Some German officers, who had dismissed Americans as soft, now had tangible battlefield evidence to support their contempt. The Americans at Kasserine were raw in ways only direct combat could reveal. Many soldiers had never fired their weapons in anger. Officers meticulously trained in peacetime scenarios found themselves paralyzed under fire. Radio communications failed. Coordination between infantry and armor broke down. Units that should have provided mutual support fought in isolation. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, son-in-law to General George Patton, was among those captured during the disaster. He had led an armored counterattack against German positions at Sidi Bou Zid, a charge that ran directly into German panzers and anti-tank guns expertly positioned in an ambush. American tanks erupted in flames. Infantry scattered. Waters sustained wounds, was captured, and spent the remainder of the war in a German prison camp. Such accounts multiplied across the battlefield. American artillery was poorly sighted. American infantry dug their foxholes in tactically unsound locations. American armor advanced without proper reconnaissance. The Germans, seasoned by 2 years of desert combat, exploited every error with professional precision. Rommel himself initially scorned the untested American troops. They appeared undisciplined and poorly led compared to the British forces he had battled for 2 years. The Kasserine debacle solidified the German belief that their fighting prowess could offset American material superiority. Reports from the battle reached Berlin. German intelligence officers produced assessments confirming Hitler's long-held convictions. The Americans were weak. Their equipment was abundant, but their soldiers lacked resolve. German martial spirit, it was concluded, would triumph over American industrial might. Yet, Rommel was too astute a general to allow initial impressions to calcify into immutable assumptions. He observed the aftermath of Kasserine, and what he saw caused him concern. The Americans recovered with astonishing rapidity. Within weeks of the defeat, they reorganized their forces, replaced ineffective commanders, and absorbed harsh lessons. General George Patton assumed command of the demoralized Second Corps, transforming it through sheer force of will. Tactics sharpened. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery improved dramatically. Air support became more effective. Patton was a relentless presence. He descended upon the Second Corps like a storm, demanding strict discipline, punishing sloppiness, and driving his men to unprecedented standards. Soldiers who had faltered during the Kasserine disaster now found themselves polishing brass, standing rigidly at attention, and training with an intensity they had never known. But Patton's influence extended beyond mere discipline. He meticulously analyzed the reasons for the American failure and implemented precise correctives. Artillery forward observers were redeployed. Tank tactics were revised. Infantry learned to integrate more closely with armor. The lessons of Kasserine were scrutinized, documented, and widely disseminated. The American military demonstrated an institutional commitment to learning from failure, a characteristic the Germans failed to recognize. Following Kasserine, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of the Army's ground forces, conducted a thorough review of the debacle. His findings were distributed to training camps across the United States, shaping the preparation of divisions yet to deploy. The errors of February 1943 became the curriculum of March 1943. Rommel later documented his observations, noting that the enemy's tactical defense had been excellent, recovering very quickly after the initial shock and successfully stemming the German advance. Unlike many German generals, Rommel did not underestimate the speed with which Americans learned from their setbacks. Carlo D'Este, a historian studying Rommel's papers, highlighted this perception. Things had improved rapidly for them, Rommel wrote, though the true extent of American mobile warfare achievement would only be fully realized with Patton's army in France. Even after the initial defeat, Rommel recognized he faced an adversary who would only grow stronger. By May 1943, 3 months after Kasserine, the North African campaign concluded. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner-of-war camps, a number exceeding those captured at Stalingrad. The same Americans who had faltered at Kasserine were now among the victors. The swiftness of the American recovery astonished German commanders, who had expected a much longer period of demoralization. In their experience, routed units required months to regain combat effectiveness. The Americans had rebuilt in weeks. This demonstrated psychological resilience was perhaps more alarming than their material resources. German prisoners captured in Tunisia expressed surprise at American logistics. The American soldiers they fought appeared to possess unlimited ammunition, fuel, and food. When German units faced shortages, they improvised. When American units ran low, replacement supplies arrived within days. The implication was clear to German intelligence officers analyzing the North African campaign. Material superiority could compensate for inexperience. The Americans had been outfought at Kasserine, but they had never been outsupplied. As long as American factories continued to produce, American armies would continue to fight. The crucial question, then, was whether Germany could secure victory quickly enough to render this production differential irrelevant. After Tunisia, that question had an unequivocal answer. They could not. This pattern reasserted itself throughout the war. American forces initially stumbled, rapidly learned, and continuously improved. The very troops who had fled from German tanks in Tunisia would later assault the beaches of Normandy and drive across France. The same pilots who had been outmaneuvered by seasoned Luftwaffe veterans would eventually clear the German Air Force from the skies. This adaptive capacity was ingrained within American institutions. The Army's Ground Forces Command maintained a perpetual feedback loop between combat operations and training facilities. After-action reports from the front were analyzed within weeks and integrated into revised training programs. Doctrine was updated based on battlefield experience. Equipment underwent modifications to address problems identified by soldiers in combat. The system was not always elegant. It often appeared chaotic. Different units devised unique solutions to similar issues. Coordination among branches of service remained imperfect. Yet, this very chaos proved productive. Successful ideas survived and proliferated. Failed approaches were abandoned. The organization as a whole gained effectiveness even when individual components struggled. German military culture, conversely, had solidified around rigid doctrines and personal loyalties. Initiative was discouraged. Failure often proved fatal to careers. The same inflexibility that generated brilliant early victories became a liability when circumstances shifted. The Wehrmacht could execute plans with devastating efficiency, but it struggled to adapt when those plans went awry. Hitler exacerbated this rigidity. He constantly meddled in military operations, overriding his generals based on intuition rather than analytical assessment. Commanders understood that disagreeing with the Führer was, at best, career-ending and potentially fatal. Honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that validated Hitler's preconceptions. The contrast between American and German organizational cultures was starkest in how failure was handled. When American commanders faltered, they were replaced but rarely punished. General Lloyd Fredendall, responsible for the Kasserine Pass debacle, was relieved of his command but reassigned to train new troops in the United States. His experience, even that of failure, was considered valuable. When German commanders failed, they risked not only their careers but their lives. After the July 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler's paranoia intensified. Generals suspected of disloyalty faced execution. Even success offered no guarantee of safety if it contradicted Hitler's directives. This fostered a culture of conformity at the most critical juncture. German officers who recognized the futility of their strategic situation often remained silent, because speaking honestly was too dangerous. The information reaching Hitler passed through layers of individuals who delivered what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to know. The German generals who had dismissed American fighting quality at Kasserine never fully revised their evaluations. They attributed American successes solely to material abundance, refusing to acknowledge the institutional learning that rendered that abundance effective. They persisted in believing that German martial spirit could overcome American industry, even as American armies pushed them back across France, over the Rhine, and into the German heartland itself. When D-Day occurred in June 1944, German commanders in France were overwhelmed by the scale of the invasion force. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the first day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. The logistics required to transport such a force across the English Channel and sustain it on hostile shores represented an organizational triumph that German planners had considered impossible. The American contribution to the invasion was immense. The equipment supporting the assault, the landing craft, the transport aircraft, the tanks and trucks advancing inland from the beaches, originated largely from American factories. The ships bombarding German positions were constructed in American yards. The aircraft that dominated the skies were products of American assembly lines. German defenders fought with characteristic determination. In certain sectors, they inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers, but they were ultimately swamped by the sheer volume of personnel and material the Allies brought to bear. When an American infantry company encountered a defended position, they requested artillery support. The subsequent artillery barrage involved not just a few shells, but hundreds, sometimes thousands, pulverizing defensive positions. As the infantry advanced, tanks provided support. If tanks were halted, aircraft were called in. The Americans had learned to integrate combined arms in ways that exponentially amplified their combat power. German soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front noted that the American style of warfare differed from Soviet tactics. The Soviets employed vast numbers of men against problems. The Americans employed vast numbers of machines. The outcome was similar. Overwhelming force applied relentlessly, but the human cost to the Americans was comparatively lower. This was a deliberate choice. American doctrine expressly prioritized firepower over manpower. Why risk soldiers when ammunition could be expended instead? Hitler's misjudgment produced consequences that rippled through every level of German strategy. Because he believed America would not intervene effectively, he declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, drawing an enemy into the conflict he had no necessity to fight. Because he believed American industry could not fulfill its promises, he permitted the U-boat campaign to persist long after it had lost strategic viability. Because he believed American soldiers were weak, he failed to adequately reinforce the Western Front until it was too late. The declaration of war against America in December 1941 remains one of the most perplexing strategic decisions of the 20th century. Germany was not compelled to declare war under the Tripartite Pact with Japan. That agreement stipulated mutual defense only if one partner was attacked, not if one partner initiated an attack. Hitler could have maintained neutrality toward America while Japan engaged in the Pacific. His advisors pointed this out. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop reminded Hitler that such a declaration would add another enemy without corresponding benefit, but Hitler dismissed the concern. He believed war with America was inevitable and that Germany might as well strike first. More significantly, he held the conviction that America was inconsequential. A nation of racially mixed people, fractured by class and tainted by Jewish influence, could not possibly influence the outcome of the war. This contempt shaped German strategy throughout the entire conflict. Resources that could have strengthened the U-boat fleet were diverted elsewhere because the American industrial threat was not taken seriously. Reinforcements that might have shored up North African defenses were sent to the Eastern Front, as the Mediterranean was deemed a secondary theater. Preparations for an Allied invasion were insufficient because the scale of American power was fundamentally misunderstood. The men who had dismissed American production figures as propaganda witnessed those figures become reality. The generals who had scorned American fighting quality found themselves in retreat before American armies. The strategists who had calculated that Germany could win a war of attrition discovered that attrition overwhelmingly favored the side with greater resources to sacrifice. By 1944, Germany contended on 3 distinct fronts, with resources barely adequate for one. The Eastern Front absorbed the majority of Germany's military might. The Mediterranean theater bled away divisions that might have defended France. And the aerial bombing campaign, largely executed by American aircraft, devastated German industry and urban centers. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, dispatched formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers over Germany in daylight raids, missions that would have been impossible without America's industrial capacity. Early raids suffered terrible losses. German fighters and anti-aircraft defenses exacted a heavy toll, yet the Americans absorbed these losses and continued. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers and their crews in a single raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. These losses were proportionally worse than anything the German Air Force had endured. American commanders debated whether daylight bombing could continue, but American factories replaced the lost aircraft within weeks. Replacement crews arrived from training programs that had expanded to meet the relentless demand. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force was stronger than before Schweinfurt, and it now possessed long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustang, capable of protecting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe confronted an impossible equation. Every American aircraft shot down was replaced by 3 more. Every seasoned German pilot killed was irreplaceable. The balance of attrition, which German strategists had believed would favor their superior training and tactics, had irrevocably reversed. Hermann Göring, who had once dismissed American production claims as fantasy, lived to witness his Air Force dismantled by the very industrial might he had ridiculed. After the war, during a prison interrogation, he conceded that the pace of American shipbuilding, especially Henry Kaiser's initiatives, had surprised and troubled German planners. Claims of constructing ships in 8 to 10 days had seemed outlandish, but they proved to be true. By spring 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich was in its final collapse. American and British forces advanced from the west, while Soviet armies closed in from the east. German cities burned under continuous bombing, which the Luftwaffe was powerless to prevent. The factories that had forged the Wehrmacht's weapons lay in rubble. The concluding months of the war starkly revealed the extent of German planning failures. Strategic reserves were exhausted. Fuel supplies were depleted. The transportation network lay shattered. Industries that had somehow endured years of bombing finally succumbed to the systematic destruction of their supply chains. German soldiers continued to fight with their characteristic tenacity, but they did so without hope. Ammunition was strictly rationed. Vehicles were abandoned due to lack of fuel. Replacement equipment no longer arrived because the factories producing it had ceased to function. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered much of Europe, was reduced to scavenging for provisions. American forces, meanwhile, seemed to possess limitless resources. When tanks were destroyed, new ones arrived. When ammunition was expended, more materialized. The logistics system supporting the Allied advance was itself an organizational marvel, moving millions of tons of supplies across an ocean and an entire continent to the front. Lines. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy network that supplied Allied forces after the Normandy breakout, transported 400,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months. American drivers, many of them African Americans serving in segregated transportation units, drove continuously to keep the advancing army supplied with fuel, ammunition, and food. This convoy consumed more fuel than the combat forces it supported, but America had fuel to spare. Germany did not. This abundance permeated every facet of American military operations. American soldiers received hot meals. German soldiers foraged. American units benefited from medical support that evacuated wounded men to field hospitals within hours. German wounded often died awaiting treatment that never materialized. American armies possessed replacement parts for damaged equipment. German armies cannibalized broken vehicles to keep others operational. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, still convinced of the accuracy of his initial analysis. If Germany had lost, it was because the German people had failed him, his generals had betrayed him, or fate had conspired against him. He never accepted that his fundamental assumptions about America had been erroneous. In his final days, Hitler ranted about miraculous weapons that would reverse the tide, about divisions existing only on paper, about counteroffensives that were impossible. He had long since lost touch with reality, yet his delusions regarding American weakness persisted until the very end. The nation he had dismissed as racially inferior and industrially incapable had crushed his armies. The evidence was irrefutable. The country he had labeled as decayed had outproduced Germany by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. The people he had called soft had fought with fierce determination across 2 oceans. The industrial capacity he had ridiculed as propaganda had buried the Wehrmacht beneath an avalanche of steel and explosives. The numbers told the undeniable truth. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million army trucks. These statistics were not propaganda. They were tangible reality. Henry Kaiser did not become a widely recognized figure after the war. He returned to private enterprise, eventually constructing hospitals, automobiles, and housing developments. The shipyards that had launched vessels every few days were dismantled or repurposed for peacetime production. The workers who had achieved what established experts deemed impossible returned to their ordinary vocations. The Willow Run plant, which had produced more bombers than Germany could ever shoot down, was sold to other manufacturers. For decades, it produced automobiles instead of aircraft. The assembly lines that had churned out B-24 Liberators every 63 minutes were reconfigured for civilian output. By the time General Motors closed the facility in 2010, few remembered its wartime contribution. The men and women who had forged the arsenal of democracy dispersed back into their everyday lives. Welders returned to farms and factories. Riveters became homemakers and educators. The workers who had accomplished production miracles that German intelligence had dismissed as impossible faded into anonymity. Yet, some remembered. Charles Sorensen, the Ford executive who designed the Willow Run assembly line, documented his team's achievements in a memoir. Kaiser's shipyard workers formed reunion associations that met for decades after the conflict. The women who toiled in factories across America were eventually honored with the Rosie the Riveter World War II Home Front National Historical Park, established at the site of the Richmond shipyards in 2000. The lesson of their accomplishments should not be forgotten. The German misjudgment of America was not merely a failure of intelligence. It was a profound failure of imagination. The German leadership viewed America and perceived only what they expected to see, a soft, fragmented, undisciplined nation unfit for war. They failed to perceive what truly existed, a slumbering colossus with immense industrial capacity, organizational ingenuity, and a human resolve that would prove irresistible once aroused. Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral who orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack, grasped what the Germans did not. Having studied in America, he understood its capabilities. After Pearl Harbor, he famously cautioned that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, filling it with a terrible determination. Germany never possessed a comparable voice of caution, largely because Germany never considered America seriously enough to study it with true diligence. The factories that once birthed Liberty ships and B-24 bombers have mostly been demolished. The workers who staffed them have passed into history. The war they helped win concluded 8 decades ago. The story, however, retains its relevance because misjudgment continues to exact human cost. Nations still underestimate their adversaries. Leaders still confuse their assumptions with reality. The German High Command believed what it wanted to believe about America, and that belief culminated in catastrophic miscalculation. The roots of German misjudgment ran deep. Nazi ideology posited that racial purity formed the bedrock of national strength. America, with its immigrant population and African-American citizens, seemed, by its very existence, to refute this thesis. If the Nazi racial worldview held true, America should have been weak. Therefore, German leaders convinced themselves America must be weak. This was the fundamental error. German strategists started with their conclusions and then sought evidence to support them. They observed America's unpreparedness in 1939 and concluded Americans could not prepare. They noted American diversity and concluded Americans could not unify. They saw American comfort and concluded Americans could not sacrifice. Each conclusion proved incorrect. Americans prepared faster than anyone thought possible. Americans unified around the war effort with remarkable solidarity. Americans sacrificed in ways that would have seemed unimaginable before Pearl Harbor. But German leadership could not perceive this, because doing so would have required abandoning assumptions central to their entire worldview. History does not merely repeat itself, but often echoes. The generals and admirals who dismissed American production figures as propaganda, who scoffed at American fighting quality, who believed that material abundance could not overcome German martial tradition, were not unintelligent men. They were capable professionals who allowed deeply held preconceptions to overshadow objective evidence. They saw an America that aligned with their assumptions and ignored the America that was actually there. The industrial might that ultimately crushed Nazi Germany did not emerge from nowhere. It originated from shipyard workers in Richmond who toiled around the clock, from assembly line workers at Willow Run who constructed aircraft faster than anyone believed possible, from farmers, shopkeepers, and teachers who donned uniforms and learned to fight. These were not superhuman individuals. They were simply ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary feats when circumstances demanded it. The housewives who became welders had never envisioned themselves working in factories. The farmers who became soldiers had never imagined crossing oceans to fight. The bureaucrats who became logistics officers had never conceived of moving millions of tons of supplies across continents. Yet, they undertook these tasks. They acquired skills they had never possessed. They endured hardships they had never anticipated. They achieved feats that experts had declared impossible. And when the war concluded, most of them returned to their ordinary lives and rarely spoke of what they had done. The German misjudgment was ultimately a failure to comprehend human potential. Hitler looked at Americans and saw their limitations. He failed to see their capacity for growth, for adaptation, for rising to challenges that appeared insurmountable. He mistook the America of peacetime for the America that would emerge under intense pressure. This is perhaps the most crucial lesson. Nations are not fixed entities. Societies are not static. The capabilities evident in peacetime are not necessarily the ultimate limits of what is achievable in war. A country that appears weak in one moment can become formidable in the next, provided its people possess the will and the organizational capacity to mobilize. Germany had built its military over many years of painstaking preparation. The Wehrmacht that invaded Poland in 1939 was the culmination of decades of planning, training, and investment. German strategists assumed this head start was decisive, that no nation could close the gap quickly enough to matter. They were mistaken. America closed that gap in months, not by mirroring German quality, which would have taken years, but by overwhelming German quantity with American abundance. The American approach differed from the German. It was less elegant, less refined, yet ultimately more effective. Hitler looked at America and perceived a decayed country incapable of holding together. He was looking at the wrong America. The America that truly mattered was not the one shaped by his prejudices. It was the America that built ships in days and bombers in hours, that transformed raw recruits into combat soldiers in months, that absorbed defeats, learned from them, and emerged stronger. That America, the real America, was messy, chaotic, and by German standards, inefficient. But it won.